Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for coming along. I just wanted to, my duty tonight is simply to welcome everybody here. I'm Anita Tang, I'm the Manager for Policy and Advocacy at Cancer Council New South Wales, and I'm thrilled that so many people come on to share the occasion with us tonight. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And on behalf of Cancer Council and many of, in fact probably all of us in this room, no matter what the work is that we do to make sure that we commit to the efforts that are needed to reduce the disparities for Aboriginal people in Australia. So we've come together tonight to hear from Bill Toliver, who I will introduce in a minute. I want to say that I'm personally very thrilled to be able to be part of bringing together such a diverse group of people. I'm pleased that some of you have had a chance to chat to people tonight after you arrived. Hopefully some people you didn't necessarily know before, but have found some connection to now. But we have in the room for tonight people who are involved in many different causes. We have people who are passionate about climate change action, international development, health advocacy. We have people who are concerned with social justice and making sure that people who are very disadvantaged get the services and supports they need, people who fight for labour rights, and people who are interested in Aboriginal issues. And I think that that's only the people I know, really. So I'm sure there are many more than many other issues in this room, people working on those that I haven't met. But I think what brings us together on this occasion, and hopefully on many others like this, is our determination and our desire to create a better world for people for whom that doesn't easily come. And there's a phrase that is sometimes used about the gap between the world that we see and the world that we want. And I think something that is common to everybody here tonight, carving out the time for being here, is that we all want to be part of creating the world that we want, rather than being satisfied with the world that we see. So I think that for me, my background before I came to the Cancer Council was actually working with socially disadvantaged groups, particularly people with intellectual disabilities. I think some of the values that apply in that world apply to the worlds and the issues that you all work on. We all want a world that's fairer, that's safer, that's more generous. And in fact, Bill, who's already very generously spoken to us once today at an internal event, had a phrase which I love, which was trying to decouple affluence from influence. And I think that's something that many of us come across too, that the people who have most influence are the ones who are affluent, and I think we can change that. So Bill is going to share with us some of his insights from his work. Bill is a person who is a self-confessed, I think, person who was originally working in branding communication for large corporates and has now turned his attention to how do you apply those skills in the non-profit world, particularly those involved in social change. He's widely recognised for his ability to marry the tactics of consumer marketing and social media with strategies for building social movements, which is what we're interested in tonight. I do want to acknowledge that we wouldn't be here tonight. This wouldn't have been possible without more strategic, quite plainly. Martin, Paul and I used to work together at Cancer Council. I'm still there, Martin's not here. But Martin emailed me to say that he had heard this speaker in an international conference a couple of years ago, Bill, who was by far and away the best speaker he'd heard at that conference, and he was determined to bring it back to Australia, which he duly did, because when Martin says he's going to do something, he delivers. And that Bill was actually going to be here for some days more than the actual conference, and would I be interested in doing something with him? And did I think there were people in Sydney who would be interested in hearing what Bill had to say? And I think Martin was probably a little surprised at the speed of my email response and the depth of detail to which I had talked about what we could do with Bill. So I do want to thank Bill in advance for his generosity. The insights that he will share with us come from the work that he's done with non-profit organisations in the US, but many of them are global, and how they can change their approach to strategic decision-making, communications and persuasion, which I think is at the core of everything that all of us do, no matter what our issue is. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Bill. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita. Thanks. I always appreciate the kind words, but I wish that somebody would lower expectations so that we could go up from here instead of down, because I'm not nearly as good as much of what she just said. In fact, you know, they always say in the United States, if you're a real player, if you're a real tough guy, you've been fired from something. right? That shows that you're really at the leading edge. Well, I'm one of those guys. I'm that kind of a badass. But I was fired from Toastmasters because I couldn't stop flailing my arms and walking around and everything else, and they literally asked me to stop coming back. So please bear with me. Also, you know, I would love it, this is an intimate enough group, if we could make this more conversational rather than presentational. Feel free if you want to raise your hand or something like that. I'm going to try and make my remarks rather quick so that we can get to some questions as well. And I probably, as I'm speaking, I'm going to probably say a few things that might seem offensive, either because of my point of view or frankly some of the language that I'll use. I apologize for that. Sometimes I get another reason that Toastmasters asked me to stop coming back, a reason that IBM asked me to stop coming to work, for those kinds of things. But I can promise you that I will never say anything as offensive to you as the first person I met in Australia at the Fundraising Institute who said, he came up to me and looked me in the eye and said, "Sir, I'm really concerned that you might not have a proper dongle for my Mac." And when he said that to me, I thought, what the heck are you trying to accuse me of? And then I learned what a dongle was in Australia, and I thought, okay, I apologize. But that was a rather shocking thing to hear as my first introduction, that I didn't have a proper dongle. I want to start by talking very briefly about, if I may, talking very briefly about the issue of who's leading who, who's following who. Because I think what we've got going on right now in our world is that we have been using a model that frankly hasn't been serving our industry very well for a long time. That model is built on things like direct mail, which is predicated on a 98.5% failure rate. If you're doing a direct mail program and you get a 2 or a 3 or a 4% response rate, you've literally spit the dummy with joy. And the fact of the matter is, another way to look at that is a 96, 97, 98% failure rate. And yet we lose track of that. We tend to forget that these kinds of things aren't necessarily serving us as well as they might. So it's not that the direct marketing industry is wrong. It's just too much of what's being done under the guise of direct marketing isn't necessarily serving our industry and our business the way it should. So what have we done? Well, now we've replaced it with online direct marketing tools like emails and things like that, which are predicated on a 99.99% failure rate, but they're free, so what the heck? We'll just give it a try anyway. But when you think about it, advertising, a typical American city dweller, and I think it's probably reasonably true here in Australia as well, is exposed to 2,000 advertising and marketing messages in a single day. And you think about that and just think, how is that possible? Well, here's the dirty little secret about that, is that of those 2,000 messages, they've done all sorts of surveying and polling, and the fact is 2 of those have an impact, and 1 of those has a negative impact. So in a way, this multi-billion-dollar industry literally cancels itself out by the end of each business day in terms of the effect that it has on us. If you think about broadcast, now that we've got cable television and direct television and everything else, 500 channels, and literally you can develop bursitis in your joints trying to find anything that you'd watch. And I wound up finding sometimes I've gone through 80 channels and there's not anything that's caught my attention for more than 3 seconds. If you look at viral video, we all have the desire to say, let's do a viral video. That's not a strategy, that is a gift from God when it does happen on occasion. The reality of video today in the internet era is that 35 hours of video content are being uploaded to the web every single minute right now. So for those of us that are pinning our whole strategy on the big hope that we're going to have a video that goes viral and gets 10 million viewers, I wish you the best. And then let's not even think about what the consequences are to our environment and everything else. It's just insane. I thought this was the perfect manifestation of what the world of marketing has given us. When I think about it, you know, I used to do this for a living, as we said. When I think about what it all means, I think to myself, every one of those things, there were corporate executives that fretted for days over the color scheme and the font of their signage. that fought for months about their logo and their slogan and everything else. And at the end of the day, it just becomes this big stew of content. So we would love to believe that now that we've got the internet era, that things are different. But I don't think they are. Look at this. That is a snapshot from a place called Luna Partners of the current people involved in social media and social marketing. There are social intelligence companies, social business software, blogging platforms, social scoring, social marketing, streaming platforms, social commerce platforms, all these different things. And you look at that and you say, what is really driving this? When we thought about what social media was, when we thought about its potential, when we thought about what it could bring to us, it was going to be the great equalizer. It was going to be the thing that made all people, that did separate influence and affluence, that did give a voice to the voiceless. But in reality, it's been cultivated and developed and propagated by people with a different incentive, with a profit incentive. And that's not a bad thing, that's a great thing. Thank God they did it. But what we have to realize now is that though they've done it, they've cultivated this model, it's not really going to be able to go much further. And it's certainly not going to serve us until we begin to seize control of what this social marketing model could really be. That's the possibility. Now when you think about it, when you think about what radio was, radio for its first 15 to 20 years was simply a replication of the playhouse in our local community. We called it vaudeville in the US. Then when TV came, for the first 15 or 20 years, it was just radio that you could see. And now that the internet's here, it is basically some combination between reality television and direct marketing. But if you look at what the major Google searches are around the world, it's rather disappointing. Various things about celebrities, various things about products, various things about, exciting social events, but nothing really substantive. And that's something we've got to ask ourselves about. Is consumer marketing really the mindset? Is that the modeling that we should be using when we think about our causes? When you think about most consumer marketing, it's intended to get people to think as little as possible. It's intended in many respects to get people to act as impulsively as possible. It's a set of tactics that are directed to create a transaction. And its only assessment of greatness is a mathematical assessment of ROI, return on investment. It doesn't matter if you get a 1.5% response rate in direct mail if it was cheaper than the money that you were able to bring in. And I think about our causes, and I think we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. And the fact of the matter is, it's also asking us to spend that last 15% of our income that frankly would probably do better just putting in the bank. So it's a question. And now that we have so many board members, and there's so much of a bias, I mean, in the United States and in England, places like that, it is amazing how much pressure there is to sort of businessify your nonprofit. Come up with more measurable results. Show us more process. Show us more statistics. Show us these things. And you really have to ask yourself, it's not that there's a wrong thing there. I think nonprofits have been able to get away with too much for too long. But that doesn't mean we have to replicate a business model because a business model wasn't designed for us. So we have to find a new way to be accountable. But if you think about it, most business is to build shareholder value, not to affect some monumental change. The end game, selling features and benefit-laden products or services. That's what the business is all about. I need you to buy my LG dishwasher, or I need you to do a test drive in my car, or I need you to do something else. So it's more focused on that sort of a thing. And I can get away with talking about features and benefits, and it's really a harder task to do when we think about what we do. A desire for political correctness too. I worked with an organization that I'm not going to name at the moment right now, but this is an organization that was working at the absolute cusp of women's rights issues around the world. They were dealing with the most challenging and difficult topics, things like child sex trafficking, things like marriage of young girls in their 10, 11, 12 years old, things like female genital mutilation. And they've been doing amazing work, being activists, changing laws, doing all these things inside of various countries around the world. Well, they've been getting a lot of pressure from their board of directors to try and bring in more corporate money. And sure enough, a couple of years ago, they got an offer from a corporation to give them a consistent donation of $5 million. To them, that was a massive amount of money. But in the process of the conversation, it became, the corporation began to express some concerns that some of the way they present themselves and some of the edginess is a little bit off-putting, and could they instead think more in terms of a slogan like girl power? And you think about that and say, for $5 million, that's a sale of your soul, you know? And you think about that and say, it's not that the corporation's wrong doing that, but the equation was out of balance, because that corporation should have seen themselves as getting great largesse for being affiliated with their brand. Instead, they were willing to sell anything to be part of this corporation's brand. Well, the good news is they turned it down, which I'm grateful to say, because they just couldn't take something as powerful as what they really stood for and frankly dumb it down to girl power. It just wasn't right. So they too use a math model, and there are profound focus on market trends and customer research and data and consumer behavior models and things like that. And it's amazing to me the number of organizations today that will do a survey, do some focus groups, and decide that they need to evolve their communications about cancer, or they need to change the way they're talking about child welfare or something like that because they saw a focus group. So, the question that goes through my mind that just haunts me every day is, what would Mandela have done with a website? What would Martin Luther King have done with a smartphone? What would Gandhi have done with something as simple as a Facebook page? You look at some of these as ACT UP, the gay rights movement around HIV/AIDS in the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s. You look at Earth Day and these things and you say, my gosh, in a way, what we've been trying to do in corporate America, but also with all these new marketing tools, is come to something that is even 1/100th of 1% of what Mandela was able to do from prison, and what Martin Luther King was able to do with buses and no telephones and an illiterate population. And Gandhi, at the time that he spoke, he never spoke about Gandhi, he just spoke about the plight of the Indian people and people around the world when they were using teletypes and things like that, and telegraph machines instead of radio and television and everything else. Everybody in the world knew what that was about. In the 1980s, when I was going to college, and I had a beautiful mullet that went all the way down the back of my head, and I was literally half the man I am today in terms of stones. In the 1980s, I would go out with a group of my college friends and throw eggs every Saturday morning at the South African Charge d'Affaires house in Seattle, until he moved. And then we would go, we took over a subway tunnel because we found out that one of the artists, the architects that built our subway tunnel, put South African marble up. So we took over the subway tunnel until they literally took $11 million of South African marble off the wall and shipped it back to South Africa. And then we took over the Student Union building until our college divested itself of any South African investments. And when Whitey McWhiterson from Seattle, Washington is fighting for Mandela, apartheid's days are numbered. But he went to prison the year I was born, and he got out of prison the year I was married. And he led every single step of the way. What if he had a web page at the time? So a more compelling question to me is not, what would Mandela do if he had a web page? But what are we obliged to do now that we do? Using the model of these amazing leaders, what is our obligation when we have these tools and assets at our disposal? Well, the first argument to be made is that it's really hard. I mean, when you think about it, these tools come at a price. I mean, first of all, we're dealing with the worst economy since the Great Depression. And there's no question about it, and it has helped funds dry up. It's the most complex and individualized media market in history. In large part, thank you, Mr. Rupert Murdoch, for totally changing the way news is delivered in my country, because now you can watch Fox News, and if you have very strong right-leaning beliefs, you can literally surround yourself with news and information, everything else that only supports those beliefs. It's not actual news, but doesn't matter. It completely choreographs and satisfies your market interest. New heights in cynicism and skepticism about organizations and how they use our money. And you know, you look at the internet today, and I don't care what conspiracy theory you want to dream up, I don't care what crazy idea you want to come up with, if you type that crazy idea into Google, you can find hundreds of thousands of people around the world that are validating everything you think and believe, whether it's right or not. Government's ability to help is limited, and its will, in a lot of respects, has become non-existent. I know you guys are going through a lot of transitions with government. My government is completely and utterly deadlocked right now to do anything meaningful. It just continues to trip over itself all the time. And giving and even advocacy has become so siloed. I can be a major anonymous giver through online types of activities, and nobody even knows what I'm doing, where I'm from, who I am, or anything else. So this is a pretty darn good set of explanations, but it's not a good excuse. And though Gandhi was a great purveyor of nonviolence, I deep down believe that Gandhi would kick our ass for thinking this way. I believe these would be fighting words to him. Because headlines and hardship and revenue sources, they're not supposed to define who we are. They're supposed to test who we are. And in too many instances, we've not shown ourselves to be quite worthy of that test. In too many instances, we found ourselves justifying and rationalizing why we can only expect a 3% increase, or frankly should be satisfied that we only had to cope with a 3% decrease. It's something we've got to think about. I think Mandela would question our commitment, because when lives and livelihoods hang in the balance of our success, then our excellence becomes a matter of moral obligation. And for too many people, they look at too many examples of the nonprofit sector and say, you're not doing good enough. There's too many of it. In the United States alone, there are 1.6 million nonprofits registered with our tax authorities. Everyone with its own fundraising activity, with its own administration, all of them focusing on various dimensions of problems, and none of the big problems in our society are really getting solved. And you have to ask yourself, what's happening? What needs to change? And so I also think Dr. King would challenge our strategy. We have to see ourselves as agents of social change. All social change requires that some catalysts bring together a critical mass of the right people who will commit to that change for as long as it takes. So we're not really social marketing experts in the social marketing business, but we're catalysts for social change. And if we see ourselves in that kind of a model, we can start to affect a different kind of a look. A catalyst has a very different type of problem to solve than a marketer. We have to be able to look at sort of 5 basic questions. Is the issue you represent worth my sacred time and energy? Is there a solution to it that I can believe in? Why should I place my faith in you? And believe me, it's not why do I think you're of value? It's why would I place my faith, my belief about my mother's health, or the future of my daughter's mental well-being, or the future of cancer, or the future of peace in your organization? What will you do with my support, and how will we stay engaged? We've got to start thinking about those 5 questions for everything we do. We also have to realize that we're community builders, not segmenters. The entire model of marketing that I learned when I was in school and that I purveyed when I was out there in the consumer world is built around a powerful concept called segmentation, which is complete bollocks, as you would say. We would say bullshit. I mean, think about it. We have a segment in the United States called males 19 to 45. And I happen to have been a 19-year-old male and a 45-year-old male, and God help me, they were very different people with very different values and very different beliefs and very different levels of sophistication. And yet, they're a typical segment in the United States. A segment is any of the parts into which something can be divided, a distinct subdivision of an organism or part, or to divide or become divided. But look at how Webster defines community. a unified body of individuals, an interacting population, joint ownership or participation. We have to take the model of segmentation and leave it behind and instead look at the model of community building. Now, does everybody know who Harley-Davidson is, the motorcycle company? Thank you very much, brought to you by the United States of America. One of the coolest motorcycles in the world. But Harley-Davidson nearly went out of business 10 years ago. And you know why? Because they started acting like they were in the motorcycle business. And they started competing against Suzuki and Yamaha and all these other, and BMW and all these other motorcycle manufacturers, Ducati. And the thing is, people from the Harley-Davidson family came back and said, we're not in the motorcycle business, we're in the rebellion business. And we simply sell motorcycles for people who wish to express their rebellion this way. And that's the difference. That's the difference. Is they don't look at the segmentation or anything else. They say, we're a community of people who want to rebel in a certain way, a certain rather controlled, rather expensive way. Before, a Harley owner was either somebody headed to jail or somebody just out of jail. Now it's women, it's attorneys, it's very wealthy people. You can't really segment a Harley owner anymore because that's not what Harley's about. They're about connecting with a value system for a community of people. Same thing is true. So now let's move from Webster to Wikipedia and talk about what's the difference between a social network and a social movement. A social network, does everybody here belong to LinkedIn? Does anybody here actually know what the heck it is and what it really means? Every time I do a presentation like this, I get 6 or 7 requests, join my network of LinkedIn. I'm thinking, okay, whatever, you know? But the thing is, I'm not exactly sure what it means. I do know that if I eventually go out of business, I'll probably send an email to everybody who I've ever connected with in history. But other than that, I'm not really sure, except that LinkedIn's constantly trying to upsell me and cross-sell me. What is a social network? A social network is a structure of nodes loosely connected, a complex set of relationships between members of a social system, where creativity is enhanced by a larger number of weaker ties. The whole construct of a social network is that it's very wide and diverse, but very shallow. That's the whole construct of it. We have a client that recently approached us and said, we need to try to do a campaign to triple our number of likes on Facebook. And I think about the like and say, we have invented a construct with the like that literally requires less mental energy and physical effort than removing lint from the lapel of your coat. Because all you have to do is move your finger 2 centimeters over and 1 centimeter down to click like, and everybody's happy. It doesn't mean anything. It means nothing. And yet, that's one of the things that board members wanted to see, is I want to see your likes up next year. It means nothing. It could mean something if we understood it as the very beginning of a relationship that we then had the responsibility to cultivate into something more. But look at a social movement, group action, the sustained, organized public effort to create change, the use of technology and internet to mobilize people globally. So if you look at that massive model of social marketing tools and companies and everything else, it really does more in the social network domain than it does in the social movement domain. And we've got to own that. We've got to change that. We have to bring that back to something we can use. A catalyst knows the difference between value and values. It's surprising to me how we wind up coming up with statistics when we're a social service agency and we say, well, we've touched 7,500 lives this year, or we've served X number of meals. And the one that drives me insane is 89.2% of all our money goes to programs. Like in the United States, if you spend more than 20% of your income on support and infrastructure and things like that, you're considered a horrible charity. I'm thinking, what business would ever let themselves comply with that kind of stupidity? Apple Computer, I don't know how much they spend on research and development. All I know is every time they turn something out of research and development, it's the coolest thing that humanity's ever seen. So do you think Apple or Steve Jobs would take a requirement like this and say, sorry, if you spend more than 20% of your revenue stream on research and development, the stock market won't favor you? That's just insanity. The bottom line is, if we spent more of our time thinking and more of our time strategizing and more of our time fundraising, we might actually start to get to some solutions that really matter. But the world doesn't want us to trip over that silly line that was arbitrarily created. Our job is to connect with people's values. Same thing is true when you think about the notion of facts versus truth. One of the biggest challenges, I think, in the nonprofit world is that it's become too easy for us to let facts get in the way of the truth. I work with an organization called Court-Appointed Special Advocates for Children. It helps children in foster care. Now, these are children that have been neglected and abused so badly that they've been removed from the court, by the courts from their homes, okay? And they are under constant pressure to say things like, and you know, if we can get them into a loving home, they're less likely to rob your house when they grow up. Or they're less likely to have unprotected sex with your daughter. Or they're less likely, and it's like, wait a minute. Are we really having to dumb it down to these kind of stupid statistics? Are we really trying to take the life of an abused child and make that equation mean something to us? And whoever it is that wants to give us money because it saves money from the prison system, don't take their money. Let them spend it on something else. Let them spend it on a math scholarship for somebody because that's what they favor. But that's what happens all the time. We work with the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation, and it's amazing how people try to have statistical evidence of the importance of saving a baby from getting mother to child transmission of HIV/AIDS. Every day, 1,000 children receive HIV/AIDS from their mother unknowingly. Why? Not because the medicine doesn't exist, not because the information doesn't exist, just because there's enough complacency and indifference that those mothers don't have access to the medicine or to the information. Full stop. I don't need to have a conversation about it. I don't need to explain what the percentage of child mortality or anything else. I can stop right there at that point of conversation and to say, mothers around the world, especially in Africa, are unknowingly transferring death and suffering to their children simply because society doesn't care enough. Full stop. I don't need to labor that with statistics or anything else. That is the truth. And I don't care how many facts I layer onto that truth, it doesn't bring more truth to it. Sometimes it starts to distract us from what that real truth is. And I think I'm not saying that facts are irrelevant, I'm saying we use them too often to lead our conversation with people instead of support our conversation with people. Because what I know is this: when I think about that mother and that relationship with her child, and that almost profound force of nature of a mother and her relationship with a child, I suddenly am 1 degree of separation from a little baby with HIV/AIDS in Africa, right? And there's no other way I can get what would be 1 degree of separation from that baby unless I can see it from that standpoint. Because every one of us has a belly button. Every one of us was fed and nurtured through an umbilical cord by our mothers. And when you think about society's most sacred obligation to a woman to not transfer this to her child, it makes the conversation much more profound and much more important. So, the other thing is, a catalyst will invoke rather than provoke. We tend to, way too often, discount the dignity of the very people we're trying to serve. Here's an example of the classic model of a UNICEF campaign. I use it because it's a client of mine. But if you look at the UNICEF campaign, don't let the word forget Elijah and the 320,000 children starving to death in Africa. And yes, it's a perfect picture, but for a fly. Elijah looks sad, Elijah has a tear in his eye, and the only thing missing from this photo is a fly on Elijah's face. It is degrading to that child. And the thing is, it's not the child's fault. And we don't need to provoke pity for a baby. What we need to do is accept responsibility as adults that we owe all children safe passage. So UNICEF began to take a different stance in their whole thing, and they've said, the fact of the matter is there are 26,000 children dying every single day of completely preventable causes. And the only moral question we want to ask the world is, what is an acceptable number? 8,000? 17,200? There's only one answer to that question. There's 0. No child in the world should ever die from a preventable cause. And UNICEF decided to take that on as its challenge. And so instead of having pitiful children or anything else in their ad campaign, they have inspirational things where they invoke the best of who we are instead of evoke tragedy and emotion and guilt and say, we're in a fight, join us. We're not trying to win a popularity contest, we're trying to win a war. So, we will also never subjugate our mission to focus group data. There are so many things out there that say, oh, you should do this, or oh, you should do that. Or guess what, Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation, people in the United States just don't care about the plight of babies in Africa. Baloney. Make them care. So, falsehood often wears the robes of commonly accepted truths. If you look at the way most companies are run, focus groups and things like that drive everything. If you look at the way Apple Computer is run, Steve Jobs, one of his most famous quotes is, a lot of times people don't know what they want until you show them what they want. And that's a fact. That is our obligation, is to be Apple-like in how we approach this work. And then a catalyst will also never subjugate its mission for money or access. The number of times an influential board member, because they are affluent, starts to veer us off of strategy, or the number of times a relationship with a corporation requires only 3% of a shift of focus, and then we have $10 million. We really have to watch out for that. I grew up in the Middle East, and the example that I always use in the Middle East is I took desert survival classes, and because I lived by the Rub al Khali, literally one of the deadest places and hottest places on earth. And the first thing they teach you in survival class is you always have one leg that's stronger than the other. And if you want to do something to get out of a bad situation like head west, what will always happen is eventually you will make one massive big circle back to where you started because one leg is stronger than the other. So the thing that you have to do in desert survival is you have to decide something on the landscape and walk towards it and never allow yourself to be diverted from that. And that's what your brand is. That's what your mission is. And don't let anybody, whether it's a board member or a corporate relationship or anything like that, begin to shift your focus. Because each step feels like it's in the right direction, but it is always slowly veering you in the wrong path. So, all social change requires that some catalysts bring together a critical mass of the right people who will commit to that change. I am so honored to be here. When they asked me if I would speak to a group of people like this, I would jump at the chance, not because I'm generous or anything else, but the chance to talk to these people in this room who are really at the cusp of the craft of social change in this city. I look at Australia, and I do believe you are a lucky country. I also believe you're an amazing petri dish of diversity, of interesting challenges, of resources and everything else. And if you could do it in Australia, I know we could sell it to the rest of the world. I know we could. And I know there's enough political will, there's enough desire, there's enough capacity here to affect real change. So, the challenge to me is there are a critical mass of us just sitting in this room. Just in this room. What is it that we're willing to fight for? What's our collective will? Who would join us if we decided to step up? Who would in fact dare try to stop us? When I think about Mandela, and I think about what it meant in South Africa to be part of the African National Congress, it meant death, it meant imprisonment, it meant a lot of things. When Martin Luther King would march across the bridge in Selma, the police were not his friend. The police would turn fire hoses and German shepherds on him for this fight. There is not a single cause that you stand for today where the police would turn a German shepherd against you or turn a fire hose on you. There's not a single cause that you stand for today that would assure your life imprisonment. Why are we not then able to achieve 10 times what the Southern Christian Leadership Conference could achieve? The opposition isn't there. It isn't there. The tools are here. What's different? What do we have to do different? I ask the question. Nobody else has the moral obligation that we do to be excellent. And so if we were to start to think of our job in those terms, what would be different? I'm doing a project right now for the electric car in the United States. And you know what the difference between the electric car never coming to fruition, never changing anything, waiting for the whole country to go green until the car's ready, until the car will become popular, or the electric car becomes a leading technology that drags the country into green behavior. You know the difference? I've got to take people and change their perception this much. I have to take them from the electric car is not for me to the subtle change of where is the electric car for me. If I can just do that, they'll do the rest of the work. They will pull the technology towards them. They will make all the problems of range and infrastructure and everything else change. It's just that subtle. It just requires a shift of focus, a shift of intention. So I'll leave it at that. I thank you so much for the chance to chat and look forward to conversation and questions afterwards.
Thanks, Bill. To get us started on the sort of question and discussion session, I've invited the orators from the Centre for Australian Progress to come and offer a few reflections on what he's just heard. I sit on the board of the Centre, which I'm very honoured to do. And for those who don't know, the Centre is a new non-profit entity designed to strengthen our ability to be catalysts in social movement in Australia. Fledgling organisation. Nick can mention a few more things about it, but I thought it would be appropriate for Nick, as the founder of the Centre, to offer a few comments in response to Bill.
That was fantastic. I think sometimes it takes someone from overseas to come and be offensive, to kind of take us up a bit, get us out of our kind of status quo mindset. So thank you so much for coming over. I guess I was really inspired by a few things here. I'll just reflect upon them just for 2 minutes, if that's okay. So then my notes are on my iPhone, so if it goes off or rings or anything like that, I apologise. The first thing I think was really interesting you said was about the challenge to focus on not just on money, on more money, but also on impact. I think that there's so many organisations that I've worked with as a consultant over the last few years who say to me, oh, we're a really small organisation. I say, oh no, how much money do you have? And they're like 12 million, 15 million, $20 million, we have 200 staff. I don't think that's a small organisation. You can do great things with large amounts of money. You need certainly enough money to pay the bills, but you can get by with much less than $12 million and have an astounding impact. I don't know how much money Nelson Mandela had, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. I think there's a real need in Australia for us to get better at focusing on impact rather than just on kind of business as usual, going through the motions, partly because we need to be innovative to keep our impact remaining as effective as it's always been, but also because we're up against really effective vested interest groups that challenge us, whether it be on healthcare, the tobacco lobby, or the mining industry for the environmentalists. These are very sophisticated organisations that are using not just marketing techniques, but actually value-based communications to win their campaigns and causes. I think your point around richer relationships, I don't know if that's what you said, but it's what I took away from your presentation was really important. The notion that I just don't think many of our organisations are even social networks. I mean, I don't know what you think, but some of the words used, like nodes that have complex relationships and codependency, didn't actually reflect my understanding of many large charities in this country or in the world. In fact, they're more like broadcast mediums that engage one to another with a large pool of people. How do we have, I guess, deeper conversations? How do we engage people in peer-to-peer championing of our work? How do we achieve that buy-in and thereafter engage people not just in our leadership groups and individual meetings, but in kind of movement-wide or organisation-wide conversations about where we're going as an organisation or as a movement. Being more authentic and human is really at the heart of this for me. Having consistency in our communication, using stories, but ultimately being authentic. And engaging people in the work of our organisation, not just asking them to support it. I think that's fundamental to what you were saying. I think that you mentioned the government's ability to help is limited with our cause. I think that's the case. But there's also, I think, the case that governments are just really bad at these things too. I mean, the Australian government has actually put I'm sure governments around the world put a lot of money into branding their government departments, kind of out of existence as being part of the government. who knows that, you know, these corporatized entities are actually even part of a kind of the biggest social movement we have in this country, which is called the government. I think the government put itself to, and our political leaders do a lot better at that humanness, that authenticity, and the effectiveness of marketing. So I think the challenge you've put forward to us is quite great. I think many of the lessons you've framed in really interesting ways, particularly this last slide, which I took a photo of, is really just very relevant to our work. So thank you. There are more comments than questions. I guess, do you have a good example of an organisation you could talk us through that that you've worked with that really took this challenge to heart? And how you convinced them that they needed to? What was the burning platform that you created?
Yeah, thank you for those very kind words. And so I want to answer two questions, one that you posed in the very beginning, and then the second question you just now asked. The first is, when you look at small entities, right? If you look at the civil rights movement in the United States, okay, I was actually if I had more time, I was going to show more slides, but if you look at the civil rights movement in the United States, Google it, you find one example of an event in Washington, D.C. Everything else happened in the most pissant little no-name counties and towns across the United States. Things like Raleigh, North Carolina, things like Selma, Alabama. The only thing those towns have, even today, is a civil rights museum because they were so central to the civil rights movement. They had no money, they had buses, and they had a will. And so money is a highly overrated construct when you think about it, because all that social change happened in the United States, small community by small community by small community, until the North and the Midwest of the United States started to go, this just seems stupid. This seems un-American. And then everything changed. Everything did. So when I think about an organization that's wrestling with these very issues and is showing the courage, I'll go back to the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation, because they're a perfect example of an organization that is going through this very same struggle. Anybody know the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation? Are you an American? No. Most don't, nobody does, but I'm gonna make it so viscerally accurate for you. You know that TV show Starsky and Hutch?
It's huge.
Yeah, Starsky and Hutch. Well, way back when, the guy that's the shorter guy with the curly brown hair is named Jan Michael Glaser, and his wife, Elizabeth Glaser, got HIV/AIDS from a blood transfusion and gave it to both her children, killing her daughter. Killing her daughter after her girl was like 11 years old. That woman fought with a maternal ferocity that nobody has ever seen before. Now, she was white, she was affluent, she had connections like you can't believe, but she left no stone unturned. And the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation focused exclusively on this issue, and at the time she gave AIDS to her child, unknowingly, there were 1,000 kids every single day in the United States that were getting HIV/AIDS from their mothers. Today, there are only 1,000 in the entire world. And every bit of that problem is solvable right now except for communications. But what happened? George W. Bush, God bless the guy, he did one thing that I'm immensely proud of as an American, which is he put more money into trying to eliminate AIDS in Africa than any other previous American president ever did in history. Created programs like PEPFAR. Well, guess what? The Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation went aggressively into Africa once we knocked it out in the Western world, in the United States, went aggressively into Africa. But at the same time that PEPFAR was happening, and over a period of just about 5 years or so, 85% of Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation funding was from government entities. UNICEF, or the United Nations, or PEPFAR, or USAID, or all these things. The beautiful thing is they were the only organization who really had a laser focus on this issue. And because of their work, this issue will go away in the next decade. But guess what? Now government funding is starting to change. They don't like point solutions, they like dimensional solutions. And so the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation is starting to have a real struggle right now. And what they've done is they've accepted that the thing that has made them distinct, that always makes them distinct, that will always guarantee they have a future long beyond pediatric AIDS, is the thing that has always fueled them, is this maternal ferocity. Is that they will approach the fight, not afraid to use the word fight, not afraid to use the word sacred, like a mother would approach this fight, like 1,000 mothers every single day do approach this fight in Africa. So this is an organization that the scientists, the CEOs, all these people who are so perfectly, beautifully well-versed in the subtleties of aid language and the science and everything else, they're willing to step back and say, but the thing that makes us distinct, and the thing you always know you've been able to rely on for the last 30 years, and what you know you can rely on the next 30 years is, we go wherever this battle takes us because we are fueled by a maternal ferocity. And what's happening is, so we started to test that story and everything else, more donors, higher donations. Because suddenly, instead of just a friend of Elizabeth or somebody who is associated, I knew a gay person way back when, people are starting to associate this in a different way. If you look at AIDS in the United States these days, it's a shameful story. I mean, basically, AIDS has become like diabetes for people that if they would just clean up their act and quit behaving so horribly, it would go away. You know, that's really what the public opinion has become. And so you go out and look at the public opinion polls and say, nobody cares about AIDS, nobody cares about children in Africa, nobody, and they just said, well, we reject what we're hearing in those polls, and all we're saying is not that people don't care, is that we've trained them how to not care, and we're going to reconnect with them through their umbilical cords. And that's what they've done. And now people are starting to see themselves 1 degree of separation. Long-winded answer, but I think it was important to set that context. Are there other questions that I can answer? Or we can just break up and have a chat? Anybody have a thought? Martin.
Martin has a question.
Martin Paul.
When you presented before, you talked about your social network, but the role of choreography.
Yeah.
Something has to be choreographic in the network. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, if you think about, well, here's a perfect illustration, okay? Let's look at child welfare in the United States. There's prenatal care, there's 0 to 3, there's 3 to K, kindergarten, and then there's K through 12, and then there's the prison system. That's the United States child welfare system in a nutshell. And the problem is that people have aligned everything around the way the funding models are, so there's all these vertical solutions. Well, a child lives that whole journey, and there's nobody that's able to help cultivate it that way. It's very much the same thing. You can look at an organization like a nonprofit organization, and they tend to silo themselves. Major Gifts is separate from advocacy communications. Change management is separate from direct marketing and all these different things. And what's missing always is each one of them thinks they have a different story to tell, and in reality they do have a different story to tell, but they lose sight of what the moral to the story is. And the thing is, I don't care if I'm talking to a government official, or if I'm talking to a first-time donor, or a foundation, or if I'm advocating to get people to volunteer and march in the streets, it's the same moral that should be doing it. We worked with a guide dogs organization a while back that learned that if they put puppies in their direct mail pieces, their fundraising would go up. Okay? For 20 years, that's what they did. Well, guess what happened? Over time, never through a conscious choice, no more blind people on their board, no more blind people on their staff, dog owners, dog breeders, dog trainers, dog freaks became part of the organization. So you look at the organization, they had a situation where a woman in Portland, Oregon was hit by a car, and 297 letters were written. 3 asked how the woman was doing, and also how the dog was doing. All 297 were saying, oh my God, that poor dog. They forgot that they were serving blind people. Not intentionally. They made a decision 20 years earlier based on a direct marketing problem, and that decision slowly but surely put some strength in one leg, and they walked themselves into a massive circle, and they became a dog organization, not a blindness organization. Their whole mission was to create the most powerful Porsche quality, Porsche costing dog, instead of the most powerful partnership that they could create. Today, they're one of the most strong blindness advocacy organizations in the country because they got back to their roots. But it was just a decision that was made 20 or 30 years earlier seemed like the right decision at the time because the money went up. They now have an endowment of $320 million, and they churn out only 300 guide dog partnerships in a year. That's money that a third world country would go to war over, for God's sake. And it's just because people will bequest millions to them because they love their dogs. That's amazing to me.
Bill, thanks for your remarks. They're very refreshing, but at the same time, they're very revolutionary. I like very much the contrast that you drew between paddlists and others, but aren't we really trained to think about social causes and particularly not-for-profit organizations in a particular way? I mean, this corporatization seems to be ingrained in us, and I'm just wondering, where there might be people working on changing the way we think about things like the percentage that goes to admin and some of the other issues that you brought up today.
Yeah, I mean, and this is where I get really excited about Australia, okay? Do you know that do you want to know the single most generous society in the entire world up until last year? Frickin' Aussies. More generous than any other society in the world, more giving. 48 million tax donations, tax-free donations given by the Australian people. Do you know the single country with the absolute highest wealth? Frickin' Australia. $119,000 average income. It's amazing. The Australian economy has a $38 billion of credit card debt. Just the interest alone on that credit card debt could solve any problem you had in this country. You name it. That's the problem. And so, your question is, we have started to think in terms of this model of corporatization and everything else. What I'm very intrigued right now is you look at certain things like Davos, or you look at certain things like a lot of the great leaders or foundations in the United States are starting to get together and they're starting to delineate problems. They're starting to become king and queen makers a little bit. And so I'm very intrigued by some of these models like the US Council on Foundations, where instead of just saying, let's give everybody $3,500, they're saying, no, let's channel our energy and give, $7 million to certain types of organizations that really seem to be showing that they're making a difference, okay? And there are certain organizations that are really, really doing so. But what I feel right now is we're going through a monumental, an existential crisis right now in my country because too many organizations are just not doing well. You know what United Way is? You guys know United Way? United Way is essentially a major community funder where you can take money out of your paychecks and then they'll distribute it to the causes that matter. So United Way has been the single largest fundraiser in the world by a long shot, okay? And they almost became like the tax collectors for the nonprofit sector. And their job was to take it and then delineate the money where it made the most difference. You know what's happened to United Way now? Something like 85% of their donations now are pre-assigned, meaning I don't trust you to make the decision, United Way. I want it to go to Planned Parenthood, or I want it to go to, and so the entire premise of why United Way exists has ended. And the fact of the matter is, they're going to have to change their whole mojo, their whole reality, or they're irrelevant, because the internet literally has replaced their need. And yet, they're one of the organizations that have the most connections with corporations because they have all corporate giving. They're one of the organizations that have one of the best connections with government, with city leadership. If they could turn that into, instead of being the tax collector, they could be at the tip of the spear, the catalyst for change of the social needs of their community, they could do that. But they've got too much arthritis of being tax collectors, and we'll see if they actually succeed. But you talk about a corporate model, that's exactly what they back themselves into, and they're paying for it dearly right now. Question? Sure.
You have mentioned Gandhi
Gandhi.
for India as well as Mandela.
Mm-hmm.
But for Gandhi's policy is differ of this side because that at that time he has made just that mistake for which the India is suffering for 65 years till today.
Yep.
Because that is the partition of Pakistan.
Yep.
That is the main mistake is done at that time. If Pakistan is not made separately, then that problem should not come
Yep.
today.
Very true.
But only that because he don't want any non-violence. He is the main cause is there. That's why we are worshipped him. But that's the partition of the Pakistan. That is the main problem for that India till today.
Yeah.
And so that Kashmir is also there.
Exactly right. I just came back from a trip to India when I was in New Delhi, and I had this very conversation with a number of my Indian colleagues. But look at that. I mean, Gandhi, at the very moment that victory was upon us, he allowed a thing to unfold with East and West Pakistan, which later became Bangladesh, and it stimulated violence in an unprecedented amount.
Yes.
People were uprooted and everything else. And I could say, yes, that was a failing of Gandhi's, you know. I could look at it and say, however, I don't know what might have changed had Gandhi lived.
Because only Punjab is suffered for that one.
Right, Punjab is,
Punjab, because we
that's right.
have suffered because some people have shipped all things in that Pakistan and they came only with clothes, and some has gone from here and they have destroyed
yeah.
everything.
We have a huge Sikh community in Seattle and Vancouver, British Columbia.
Yes.
But yeah, it's true. You know, which to me says this, that these battles never end.
Yes.
These challenges never end. Gandhi's life did. And unfortunately, with Gandhi's life, it's the same thing. If you look at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the United States today, it's a meaningless organization. It means absolutely nothing. It's fighting every day to justify its continued existence because it's lost its soul. It's lost its mission. And so the argument that I would make in this situation, go ahead.
Here also that one Sikh Sardar was killed in America only.
Yeah,
In temple also.
that's right.
That's only one fellow should have 600.
That's right. And there you have it.
This understanding of that is Muslim peoples.
Yes.
So they were thinking that they are Muslim peoples,
Yeah.
and that's why they are terrorists. They are thinking that way.
That's right. And it was a crazy guy. But here's the situation, as is always the case.
Yes.
There's a constant evolution. There was a woman on the news, an African-American woman who I absolutely love, and she says when her father would leave her a birthday card, instead of signing it, "Love Dad," he'd sign it, "The struggle continues." And she saw that as her mission. So she stepped up. And so the answer is, my country, for the first time in history, may actually look seriously at guns now. Because of examples like the Sikhs, because of the grade school, because of everything else, my country is disgusted with these kinds of issues. So the battle continues. And that's the thing. I look at the people sitting in this room. I look at the people of Punjab. I look at all these things and say, if we embrace these challenges, if we stop being subservient or somehow finding ourselves lacking, instead step up and stick our necks out, there's a lot of change that needs to happen. There's a lot of change around the world. I grew up in the Middle East. I know the plight of women in the Middle East. I know what it means to be in those situations. But guess what? I would have never predicted the Arab Spring in my life, in the life of my children, but it happened. And that's what we're here for, is to fight that fight.
Thank you very much
Yeah,
indeed,
pleasure.
Bill. Just to wrap up this evening, I just want to make a few words of thanks. My name is Martin Paul from More Strategic. I've had the great pleasure for many years of knowing Anita, and I always thought she was probably the best network advocacy person I've ever met. And she proved it by getting, I think, 72 people to sign up within a week to come along with this. So thank you very much, Anita, for your efforts. She's also a supreme delegate. She's also an excellent delegator, so we'd also like to thank Katie and Amanda, who actually did most of the work. Where's Amanda? You're both over there. But of course, mostly thank you, Bill, because I think beyond anything else, and I've had the pleasure now of hearing Bill speak 4 times in the last 4 days, and each time it just reminds me, it takes you back to, for all of us, why did we actually start doing this? You know, my very first job was actually with Greenpeace. I didn't really join Greenpeace. I wasn't working for Greenpeace. I just wanted to save the world. And I think it just comes back to reminding us, in all of our organisations and for all of us as individuals, what was our real passion? What was fueling us to do what we did? And how do we find the soul of our organisation again? And don't lose that in a corporatisation, marketing set of issues. So I really thank you, Bill, for challenging us in not only the way things should be done, but the way we actually think about our own issues and this sense that we have a moral obligation to exceed is just something we should kind of put up on a sign in our offices every single day. So there is still some food left. Please eat, drink, network, and I'm going to make up a new word, catalyse. So catalyse together, and thank you so much again, Bill. Thank you. Feel free to hit Bill's brains as well.